Now we're going to talk about state management. No, not like the state of Virginia. What is state in ASP.NET? Websites, just like web services, are stateless. This means that anytime you make a request to the server is not going to remember any of your previous requests. It can't differentiate between different users trying to access the website. This can be a problem, especially when we're trying to build a wizard process or any kind of flow that the user needs to go through, or we remember data from one step to another. ASP.NET adds the concept of state onto their web framework. This allows us to keep track of data and objects across different page requests for each user. Why do we want to use state? Well, first of all, many websites on the internet currently use state to make their websites more dynamic and more rich. It's very hard to find any kind of meaningful experience on a page that can't remember who you are or what you've done already. States allow pages to dynamically respond to different users and events. What are some examples of this? Well, this means that based on an individual user, we can do page authentication, keep track of who they are, maybe show them certain pages or different buttons based on what level of access they have. We can also personalize results for each user, depending on any number of things, like what they've searched for before, or possibly where they live. I'm sure you've all seen shopping carts online as well. How else can we keep track of what they want to buy unless we can keep track of data across different page requests? State is the answer. So how does state work? Well, simply put, state is a collection of objects. It's an array of objects that are indexed by string. You can see an example here of storing a user ID within the session. When you want to access any object within a state management, you just simply give it the key of what you're looking for, and it will retrieve the data for that user based on the key you give it. We've got many different ways to store data in these state objects. ASP.NET offers the following: session, Viewstate, application, cache, and cookies. We'll go into these with more detail right now. First, we're going to look at session. There are some important things we need to know about how session works before we can use it. First of all, what is the lifetime of the session? How long can we use it before it becomes obsolete? Well, the lifetime of a session begins whenever a user makes their very first request. Whenever a user tries to access the website for the first time, any data put into the session is going to be saved in memory on the server. That data in the session will last either until the user's session times out or until the application on the server restarts. That second part is only partially true. It is possible for session to last longer than the application itself, but this is only if you're storing your sessions inside of a SQL Server database. What is the scope of the session? Where can we use it? Well, the session is only available to the user who initiated that session. Session is one object per user. It persists across pages, meaning that no matter what page you're trying to access, you're always going to have that data available. However, the data is only available for that current user. So what does this mean for our usage? This means that we can access data across pages. However, we want to make sure we only save data that's relevant for the current user. Things like name, maybe their address, maybe their current user level. Those are things that would all normally be stored inside of the session. Next, we've got Viewstate. Well, what is the lifetime of the Viewstate? How long can we use it? The Viewstate is actually much more shorter than the session. The lifetime of the Viewstate is only the lifetime of the current page. The Viewstate is actually rendered to the page itself. Whenever a user makes a request, ASP.NET will write the current values of the Viewstate into an element on the page. Those elements will be rendered as a hidden element on the HTML page and sent back to the client. Whenever the user makes their next request back to the server, the hidden element is sent back, rebuilt into the string object dictionary that we saw previously. So what does this mean in terms of usage? Well, since it's tied to the page, it's still tied to one user. So we want to store data relevant to the current user. Also, since it's limited to one page, you really want to save data that is relevant only for that page. Here we see an example of a Viewstate. The data is all jumbled up. However, ASP.NET can interpret this data when it's sent back to retrieve the data that we saved on this page. This Viewstate is actually quite small in comparison to a normal Viewstate. You want to be careful on the types of data that you save within the Viewstate because they can grow rather quickly. Since the Viewstate is sent back and forth with each request to and from the server, larger Viewstates can hamper the performance of your website, so it's something to keep in mind. The next state object we have is the application. As you might expect, the lifetime of the application object is the life of the application itself. The application object is initiated when your service or website begins, and it ends when the service or website is killed. What is the scope of the application? The application data can be accessed anywhere on any page. It's for storing broad types of data. It's also important to know that unlike the session and Viewstate, the application data is accessible to all users in all sessions. This means that you don't want to store data that only applies to certain users in the application. It's best to store data that applies to all users. This can be things like application settings or configuration settings. The next state management object we have is the cache. What is the lifetime of the cache? Well, that's actually a difficult question to answer because the cache itself has no lifetime. Only the objects you store within the cache have lifetime. Each object in the cache doesn't necessarily have the same lifetime either. They can all be set dynamically in your application. You can have an object in the cache last based on a certain condition, based on a certain time, or any other number of things. What is the scope of the cache? Well, just like the application object, the cache is available application-wide. All users in all sessions are going to have access to this object. So what types of things do we want to use in the cache? Well, we want to store commonly accessed data. These could be complex queries that go back to the database, or interesting algorithms that may take a long time to run. By caching this data, we can make our requests more efficient and be able to service more users. Think of a store where you've got different categories of items that get sold. We could potentially requery the database every time a user wants to see the categories available. However, if we cache this data, we only need to do the query once. Each subsequent user that wants to view the categories can look up that data immediately in memory. Now we're going to talk about cookies. What is the lifetime of the cookies? Well, just like caching, the lifetime of a cookie can be variable as well. Cookies can expire whenever you want them to expire. We do, however, encourage you to be kind to your users. You want to set lifetimes that make sense for the type of data that you're storing. For instance, if you're storing data about what the user has recently searched for, that might be a shorter cookie. However, if you're storing settings that the user has saved about their account, that might be a cookie that lasts longer. What is the scope of a cookie? Well, the cookie is actually a file stored with your browser. So the file is only going to apply to one user, but it's also only going to apply to the browser with which they accessed the website. This means that if you open a page in Internet Explorer, a cookie will be saved. However, if you open the same page in Firefox with the same user, that cookie will not be available, and it will be recreated separately for Firefox. Again, what is the usage for cookies? Cookies are used for storing any kind of data about the user that we don't want to store on the server. Since we're not storing it on the server, it makes more sense to store less sensitive data. You don't want to store a user's credit card information or social security number on their machine. This can lead to many security problems. You only want to store the kind of data that would be okay if someone were to be able to see from the outside. Here's an example of a very long-lasting cookie. This cookie lasts about 20 years. Again, it might make sense for that piece of data, but you want to be kind to your users. So what are some techniques we can use to implement these state management objects? Well, one technique is to use a strongly typed state. You'll remember that the state objects are a collection of strings and objects. This means that you can store any kind of object within a state management object. This is great when you're putting objects in the state. However, what about when you're getting them back out? This means that you need to cast these objects as the type that they originally were. This can create a lot of work. Also, casting needs null checking, so that can even be more work whenever you're storing lots of different objects in the state management. A better way to do this is to pull all of your type checking and null checking into a separate wrapper class. Here, you can see an example of a strongly typed session object. We've got the user ID stored in a publicly accessible property of type integer. Instead of each page trying to access the session on its own, they can use this property to make things much cleaner. You can see that in the getter, it automatically checks whether the user ID is actually set in the session, and it also auto-casts that variable to an integer. In our setter, we simply set the variable into the session. If we wanted to, we could also do some checking in there if we wanted to only allow certain values into the session. I hope this presentation on state management has been helpful.